Hello and welcome to Culture Street. Today we have with us Hannah Richell, who is the author of Secrets of the Tides and most recently The Shadow Year. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you.
Your first book, Secrets of the Tides, was very successful, very much praised, and sold lots and lots of copies, both here and in the UK. Did you find that there was much more pressure on you when you were penning your second novel, The Shadow Year?
To a degree, yes, but yes and no, I guess is the answer to that. In a sense, I had a publishing deal, so I had a lot more confidence behind me in my ability as a writer. Secrets of the Tides was the first thing I'd ever written. So to have the backing of a publisher going into a second novel was thrilling, and it meant that I could really treat writing like a job, which felt like a real luxury to me. But then, of course, you know, having success is lovely, but then you sort of feel like you need to try and replicate that. So I felt pressure, probably more from myself than anything, that I wanted to hit the deadline that the publishers had set me, but also I wanted to produce the best possible work I could within that time frame. So there was a certain amount of pressure, but I think I was sort of putting that on myself more than anything. Because at the end of the day, I was writing the story I wanted to write. I don't think you can write, you know, for somebody else. Otherwise, you're not really being true to the story and to yourself. So the pressure really, I think, was coming from within more than anywhere.
And how long did it take from start to finish to complete this novel?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a strange journey, this second one, in that I started writing a very different story and threw myself into it knowing that I had a deadline to hit, and got quite a long way into it and then panicked because I was sort of getting lost in the story and I couldn't see a way to pull myself out of it. And then almost simultaneously I had a second idea, which ended up being The Shadow Year. And so once I'd sort of got that in my head, I just couldn't escape it. I had these scenes sort of unfolding as I was trying to write this other story, and it was such a distraction. So in a bit of a panic, I remember phoning up my agent in London and the publisher there and saying, help, you know, this is my situation. And I have to say, they were fantastic, and they just said, you have to write the story that you're excited to tell. And so kind of after a bit of soul searching, I put the first draft to one side and dived into The Shadow Year and just kind of threw myself into it. I really had to immerse myself in it to hit the deadline. But yeah, I got there in the end. So
was the process of writing it, I remember hearing that when you wrote the first book, you were sort of doing it while your young child was napping. Was it the similar thing that you were at the kitchen table writing for The Shadow Year, or
it was slightly different? Yeah, slightly different. So I was able to carve out a bit more time for myself second time round. My children were slightly older, so I had some childcare, which was brilliant. So I had sort of designated writing days, and on those days I either stayed at the kitchen table again, or I would go into the city. There's a space called the Sydney Writers' Room where I hired a desk, and so occasionally I'd go in there just for complete kind of solitude, basically, and that was great because I could just throw myself into it.
Was it easier to write in that situation than being at home, sort of at the kitchen table?
It probably was. There's a lot more distraction, I think, when you're at home. It's easier to procrastinate and find other things to do. You know, when you're in a room where really it's just a desk and a computer and you, then you just get on with it. Or I do. Yeah. I mean, the internet's a distraction. I have to sort of fight that a lot because it's too easy to kind of jump on and just distract yourself. But yeah, I found having a sort of dedicated space to write was brilliant. And the other thing actually that really helped me was I went up to the Varuna Writers' House last year and spent a week up there, which, you know, with young kids, it was a bit of a luxury just to be able to detach myself from family life for a whole week and immerse myself in the writing for a week. And I think that was the week that I really kind of broke the middle of the novel and felt like I was getting somewhere.
So in a week block like that, how much of the story were you able to write?
That was a very intensive week. I set myself a very kind of hardcore sort of deadline to hit. I think I wrote about 25 to 30,000 words that week, but that I mean, that was really just kind of going for it. And, you know,
Yeah.
a lot of those words wouldn't now appear in the finished book, but it was, I often find you have to write through the story to find the sort of content and the material that you want, and then you sort of, well, for me, I finesse it and go over it again and edit a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Your book, The Shadow Year, opens in 1980, and very close to the start of the book, there's a group of 5 university students that come together, and they feel they're not quite ready to go out into the real world. So they go to this place, this lovely, beautiful cottage in this sort of idyllic setting. Was your experience of university similar to that? Everyone in the UK goes away. They often establish great friendships in that time, and you can see within this group that that's how it opens, with this sort of intense friendship.
Yeah, that's right. So my university experience, I didn't go in the 80s, I was actually sort of mid-90s, so it was a different kind of generation, I guess, to the one that I've written about. But yeah, I went to Nottingham, which wasn't my hometown, so I lived with a group of students in a really scuzzy student house, and yeah, built up those sort of friendships with people, and it's very intense. It's a very intense time of your life, and you feel so grown up at the time, but looking back, you know, you really are still kids figuring out who you are, what you want from your life. And so I was interested in writing about a group of friends who were at exactly that stage. And I think for me the 80s appealed as well, because the early 80s in particular was a time in the UK of such great kind of change. You were sort of through from the 70s, where it was all a bit more sort of hippie free love, and Margaret Thatcher was coming into power. There was a lot of unrest and dissatisfaction, and the society was really changing to be focusing less on sort of community and more on individualism. So while it's not a book about politics, or, you know, that none of that's really mentioned in great detail, that's sort of the atmosphere that where the sort of students open the book, and they're really questioning what they want from their life.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of take a year out when they sort of go and spend time at this place. Simon, one of the characters in your book, he's sort of the leader of the 5, and very interesting and complicated, complex character. Yeah. Was it hard to get inside his head? Yeah,
I think he was probably my most difficult character to write. I don't know why. I really wanted him to be incredibly charismatic, and like you say, he's very complex, and as the book progresses, his character, it doesn't necessarily change, but hopefully the reader comes to sort of see more diversity in his character. And so, yeah, I wanted him to sort of be quite a problematic character for the reader to sort of get to know. So, yeah, I kind of struggled with him for a bit, and I hope I got him right, but you know, I wanted him to be sexy and, you know, really persuasive, and then also to have quite a lot of sort of deeper issues below the surface.
Yeah, he's a very commanding presence in that house. He really sort of is the master of everybody in there at the time.
He is very much the sort of leader, and then obviously as things change and life gets a lot harder for them at the cottage, you know, he sort of has his own moments of doubt, but not too many.
No,
he's very self-confident. Yeah.
And your main character, really, Kat, who is herself also quite interesting, but more her relationship with her sister and how that unfolds throughout the book. Do you have a sister? Is that
I do,
sort of,
yeah.
Because they're very particular relationships, I think, the ones we have with sisters.
They are. I'm really close to my sister. She's 18 months older than me, and it's interesting to me that twice now, so in Secrets of the Tides and in The Shadow Year, I've written about sibling relationships, and particularly the relationship between 2 sisters. And I think those relationships between family members, whether it's, you know, there's female family members, mothers, sisters, I'm really interested in them, and I think they have such a sort of strong dynamic. They're so powerful, those relationships in our lives, but they can also be very problematic. And I'm lucky in that I'm really close to my female family members, but you know, it's great fodder for a writer to kind of dive into that sort of more emotional landscape of relationships.
Yeah, and you switch in a similar way to in Secrets of the Tides. You switch the time frame, so you go from 1980 to 30 years later. What is it that appeals to you about doing that, switching the
so
time?
I love playing with structure when I'm writing, and so the first book I wrote was very much back and forth, and that was a way of telling a story, but sort of more like unravelling a puzzle. And it was like doing a jigsaw puzzle as I wrote it. I liked to sort of piece things together, and I had to move lots of things around to make it make sense. So when I had the idea for the Shadow Year, and I settled on the idea of the structure being 2 complete years, but sort of woven together month by month, it felt like a very neat structure, but it also gave me a chance to play sort of with the arcs of the 2 stories. I could use sort of the landscape and seasons in an interesting way, because you sort of follow the stories month by month through this very specific landscape, and you can sort of turn things on their head quite easily. You know, summer in England isn't always beautiful, and you can make, you know, the landscape can often reflect how characters are feeling or enhance a scene and a mood. So for me, the structure worked on so many different ways, because it was sort of a way to create tension and suspense as I told the story and revealed pieces of the plot to the reader. But also it was just great fun to sort of play around with it and use it in a neat way to kind of follow the thread of the story through. Yeah,
no, it's certainly beautiful to read the way those stories come together.
Oh, thank you.
The idyllic setting that you speak about is in the Peak District.
Yes.
Whereabouts is that in?
So the Peak District is right in the heart of England. It's in the Midlands, and it's one of England's bigger national park areas. And it was an area that appealed to me because the group of university students really detached themselves from society for a year. It had to be somewhere where they could feel remote, and sort of that they'd escaped the real world. It also had to contain that sort of wildness that I wanted them to descend into, so that they couldn't sort of rush off to the shops and rely too heavily on the sort of constructs of society around them. And the Peak District is beautiful because it's got so many variations to its landscape. It's got really barren moors, but it's also got chintzy, you know, English villages, and you know, forest land and beautiful rivers, and it didn't feel totally out of place to create this sort of fictional lake, a small lake, but with this abandoned cottage that they could just retreat to. So it just kind of worked on different levels.
Right. Yeah, the lake is certainly very central. I mean, it's used a lot throughout your story.
Yes.
In many ways to bring characters together.
Yeah. I loved writing about the sea in Secrets of the Tides.
Right.
So it appealed to me to then go back and write about water again and the landscape and nature, but I didn't want to write about the sea again. So yeah, the lake just it kind of came to me, and it's a beautiful metaphor as well to use in different ways. And I was also aware as I was writing of the book by Henry David Thoreau, Walden, where he retreats to a lake and sort of experiments with living on his own and sort of understanding his true nature as a human being. Yeah. So that sort of, again, you know, it sounds a bit pretentious, but it was sort of always there in the back of my head that the lake just kind of fitted the story.
There are quite a number of characters in this story, and we get to know them all really quite well. Was there a favourite that you had, one that you really felt worked well for you, and you were sad to sort of finish it?
Yeah, I really loved writing William, who is the sort of slightly older farmer in the present day who becomes friends with Lila. And yeah, I just, from the moment he sort of came to me, he was there, and he's not particularly confident, he's a slightly awkward man, but I just really enjoyed writing him, and yeah, he was definitely one of my favourites.
Yeah, he's certainly a lovable character in the story.
Yeah.
One of the other things that you use in your book is the loss of a child and the grief that's experienced and the way the emotions and a family sort of breaks down because of that grief. And you did a similar thing in Secrets of the Tides as well.
Yeah.
What is it that draws you to that sort of terrible event that creates this, I guess, disparity within a family?
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, twice now I haven't really set out to write about grief, but it seems to be sort of inherent in both stories. And I think in the case of Lila in The Shadow Year, she's a character, I wanted us to sort of meet her at a very dark point in her life. And she's a young woman, and her marriage is sort of on the rocks at the opening of the book. And
she's the story that's 30 years.
That's right,
later,
so she's the sort of present day strand of the story. And why I write about grief, I still don't really know, because it's not something I've personally experienced at any great level. But I guess in my writing, I'm interested in writing about human relationships and emotions, and there's probably nothing more powerful than grief. So I don't really know why, I don't know how to answer the question really, but I guess it's just an exploration really of human emotions, and that's sort of the starting point.
I guess something like grief tends to put the spotlight on a family, and can create this sort of
a lot of stress. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's exactly where Lila and her husband are at. You know, they're at crisis point, but you know, Lila is sort of in her own world really at the start of the book. She's, you know, struggling with so many conflicting emotions about, you know, her loss of her daughter, but also the loss of her father. And so it's just, you know, a sort of awful spot to be in really, but it then allows you to sort of follow a character's journey, and so it's kind of, for me, that just appealed to write about.
Right. And what's next for you now after The Shadow Year?
So I'm just sort of pulling my head out of The Shadow Year, and I'm pulling together my ideas for the third book, which I hope to write a little bit later this year. So yeah, I'm sort of just...
Are you hoping that will be published next year, or are you thinking probably a couple of years?
I don't have a deadline set at the moment, which is quite nice.
So no pressure.
Yeah, exactly. It's nice to suddenly feel free again. So I really would like to write something this year, but how long it takes me, I don't know. I think you just have to let it take as long as it takes to produce your best work. But obviously being aware that, you know, you want to sort of ride the crest of a wave while you can. So it's a sort of, it's a juggling act, but I'll be doing my best to write it as quickly as possible.
And the first two books have been set in the UK. Will that be something that continues, that you will continue to set your books?
Yeah, for me, I always retreat back to the UK when I start to think about writing. But I think because I'm from there originally, I've lived in Australia for 8 years, but my childhood was in the UK, and some of my sort of, you know, more life-forming experiences were in the UK. And so it's a place that I like to kind of go back to in my head, and I think childhood as well is a very powerful place to draw from in writing. So a lot of my memories can sort of inform my writing. So I enjoy writing about England, but that's not to say that I wouldn't set a book somewhere else. I've lived in Canada, and I'd love to write about Australia one day. I've got a scene in my head that keeps playing over with a character in Sydney, and so yeah, one day maybe I'll sort of branch out a bit, but at the moment my heart's sort of in my writing is still in England.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to me today. Now, The Shadow Year is out now.
It is.
And in the UK in June.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and
thanks, Sophia.
Yes, we hope to see your next book too in the next year or so.
Fingers crossed.
But congratulations on The Shadow Year. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you very much.